Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of The Parent Pod. I am Amy Leonardi, and I am your host this evening. Welcome. Every week, we bring to you resources, family-friendly businesses, self-care, recipes, and cooking, nutrition, and some education. Plus, we have a little fun. And so I hope you have the kids tucked away somewhere. If not, that's okay. Find a little corner, curl up. This hour's for you. This week, I'm really excited that we are going to be having guest Laurel Schaider, Dr. Schaider, I apologize, on our show from the Silent Spring Institute to speak to us about PFAS. And it's a really, really important topic, especially on the Cape where we have a sole source aquifer. So before I bring her on, just to cover a little bit of the evening, please share your thoughts, comments, and any questions you may have for myself or the doctor in the comments section. We'll be taking your comments, and you will be entered to win a $20 cash card to spend, hopefully, on yourself, because that's the one who really matters. Self-care, right? We've been talking about that a lot. So without further ado, now I'm going to bring on the doctor. One second here, and we're going to have some fun. Hi, Laurel. Nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me.
So I'm so excited to have you because we've worked with you the past couple of years with the Parent Resource Fair. Having been introduced through Cheryl Osimo from the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition. And you provide a great service. There's a lot of research being done into the water safety of the region. And I know it's a hot topic among a lot of people. And so we're going to kind of get into it because over time, certain things that we are doing as human beings are obviously affecting the environment, right? There's no denying that. And as a result, we are affecting things that now affect our own bodies. And that's really concerning, especially with children and the long-term effects of that. So before we start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and everything like that?
Sure. Well, again, thanks so much for having me. And I was really sad that the Parent Resource Fair is not happening this January, but looking forward to seeing you and everyone from the Cape on next year, hopefully. So I've been a research scientist at Silent Spring Institute for over 10 years now. When I was growing up, I was really concerned about the environment. I grew up in Concord, actually, really close to Walden Pond, and just had this connection to the woods and the environment, and really wanted to do something to protect the environment and kind of thinking about climate change and cutting down rainforests and things like that. And I was also a math nerd. I really love to do math and science, and have found a way to be able to do both through my work, to do research that feels important and allows me to kind of apply my interest in math and science, not just to the environment sort of out there, but the environment where we live and work and play.
So ultimately, you're a doer, that you like to do good. I mean, I love doers because I'm a doer. I like to take action on things. There's very little that I can't just sit and rest on and leave to up in the wind. There are certain things that, people are passionate about and have to be acted on. So I applaud you for that because it's a big, I appreciate it. I know lately my focus has been on outdoor learning, and that takes up a lot of my energy and time in addition to working. So I can only imagine with your fight and your studies how much time that takes up, but you have a lot of passion for it.
Absolutely.
So can you tell everybody a little bit what are PFAS, or it's an abbreviation, or
right,
if you will, go ahead.
So PFAS is an acronym, and it's late on a Friday night to be getting into chemistry, but it stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So that's a mouthful.
Big one.
Big word.
Yeah. Everybody
heard of it, and you don't see PFAS on product labels, but if you've ever heard of Teflon or Gore-Tex or Scotchgard, those are all products that have PFAS chemicals. So these are a broad class of chemicals, and they're used in a lot of consumer products to make things non-stick, stain resistant, waterproof, and grease proof. So they're very useful, and they're found in many things that we encounter in our everyday lives. And they even show up in some places you might not expect, like certain types of dental floss, guitar string, climbing ropes, paints. They're really everywhere in our day-to-day life. So they're useful and they're familiar, but unfortunately they've been raising some really important concerns over the past few years, in part because they don't break down. They've actually been called forever chemicals because their chemical structures are so strong that they don't break down. They move around, but they don't go away on their own. And they also accumulate in our bodies. So once we've been exposed to them, it takes a long time for them to be released from our bodies. And we're learning more and more that exposures to these chemicals can be harmful to our health as well.
Just out of curiosity, and this wasn't a question I thought of ahead of time, but as you're talking about how many products it is found in, can any of those products be made without that chemical by any chance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And in a lot of cases, that's absolutely true. So one of our studies focused on fast food wrappers, and this was back in 2017, and we found about half of the fast food wrappers, so things surrounding our, burgers and sandwiches and cookie pouches, about half of those had PFAS, and that meant half didn't. So there were obviously alternatives out there, wax paper, other ways to make paper appropriate for food packaging. And there's a lot of interest right now in identifying what are the non-essential uses of PFAS. So products where PFAS are, not playing an essential function, and when can we substitute them out? So they do serve a critical function, but there's another way that we can make that same product. And what are the truly essential uses? And there are maybe a few of those, like medical devices or certain types of occupational protective equipment, where we don't yet have a good substitution, and hopefully down the road there would be. But in many cases of consumer products, there are already alternatives. And sometimes it's a matter of asking ourselves, like, do we really need our couch to be stain resistant? Like, do I need to have a couch where if I drop red wine on it, it's going to bounce off? I mean, we all have kids and, messes happen, but to have that level of stain resistance means that we're having these chemicals. So sometimes it's just a matter of deciding which features are really important and which ones you can live without.
I think it's important that you mentioned, and of course to parents listening, one of the biggest ones you just mentioned, fast food wrappers, cookie type wrappers, things our children, I mean, I'm guilty of it, bringing the kids to fast food when I'm exhausted. I have no idea they were in those wrappers, and that's concerning because, we're already going to be hard enough on ourselves for bringing them to McDonald's, but then now I've got to worry about the chemicals in those wrappers, and I think that's concerning. And if they can find ways to make those products without it, they really need to, unless, like you said, it's essential.
And it's interesting you mentioned McDonald's. Just a week or two ago, McDonald's actually made an announcement and said that they were going to stop using food wrappers that have PFAS in them. So it's going to take a few years for them to, use up their inventory of what they've got. But and we can talk more about environmental regulations and kind of how slowly those are improving or not improving. But I think in the shorter term, consumer action is really important, and people letting their retailers know, we want products that are non-toxic and don't have these harmful chemicals really can make a difference. And once retailers start saying we're not going to sell these products, then the manufacturers will make other products.
Absolutely. The power is really with the consumer at the end of the day, because we're the ones buying.
It shouldn't have to be. You should be able to go into a store and assume everything is safe. But unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Not yet. Someday, right? We hope.
We're
hopeful. Let's talk about the health effects, because we talk about they're harmful, but what are the health effects of these, both short term and long term?
So it's really an area of evolving research. I mentioned that it's a broad family of chemicals. The most recent estimate from EPA is that there are 9,000 different PFAS chemicals and polymers out there. And we really have very limited information about most of those. Just a few of them have been studied in depth. And what we know about those few is very concerning. So PFAS chemicals have been associated with elevated cholesterol, with obesity, with effects on the thyroid and the kidney. And one health effect that people have been thinking about a lot lately is potential effects on the immune system. There's research from our friend and colleague, Dr. Philippe Grandjean from Harvard University. He's done a series of studies in the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic, where people have been exposed to PFAS, not so much from water, but from their diet, from the food they harvest from the ocean. And his research suggests that children who have higher PFAS exposures may mount less of a healthy immune response to vaccinations. And vaccines are on everybody's mind right now. And there have been other studies suggesting that PFAS exposures might increase susceptibility to colds or fevers. And we're still learning about that. But obviously right now with COVID, that kind of heightens our concern about the immune system, and whether, especially for people that have had really high exposures, and some communities have had high exposures from drinking water contamination, whether those people might be at elevated risk.
And I can imagine that communities that have prolongated exposure, like especially from infancy or when they're in utero, all the way throughout their lives, that's where you're seeing, the biggest health effects potentially for PFAS.
Right. We think that exposures that happen early in life, in the womb, and some chemicals like PFAS can be passed along during breastfeeding, and just those early life exposures can matter. Obviously, breastfeeding is still the best if possible. We don't want people to be deterred from that, but really we want to make sure that women don't have to worry about that, right. Our bodies don't. It
shouldn't be a worry at all. Like you said, we should be able to trust that our products and our drinking water is safe. But that's concerning that something bad can pass through with something so good. So I think that's, and that was going to be my next question. Can infants be exposed via breastfeeding? How else can people be exposed? We've talked about water. They can be exposed through diet. Are there other ways additionally?
Sure. So we talked about food packaging and the concern that chemicals that are in the packaging could migrate into the food, or in the case of microwave popcorn bags, those are good to stay away from. You can make popcorn on the stove instead. Those we think we could also breathe in when those bags get heated up. There are certain PFAS that can actually end up in the air, and we can breathe them in. We can be exposed from the food itself. So fish and animals and plants, if there are PFAS in the environment where they're raised or where they live, that can accumulate in the food, and we can be exposed that way as well as from the packaging. And then when we PFAS in our consumer products, those chemicals don't just stay in the products. They can migrate out. If you're a child and you hang out a lot on the floor, then you might, you eat or breathe in a certain amount of dust, and dust can pick up chemicals from, fibers from your carpet if it has stain-resistant coatings, or dust can also end up accumulating chemicals from the air as well. So that's why it's important to, wash your kids' hands before they have a snack if you can. Kids are always putting their fingers in their mouth. So if they're touching a stain-resistant carpet or furniture and then they're licking their fingers, there can be movement that way. And I think one important question that scientists don't yet know the answer to is, what's the most important source of exposure? If you're in a community where the water has a high level of contamination, that's your biggest worry. But for the rest of us whose water does not have high levels of PFAS, we're still learning more about what are the most important ways that we're exposed to them.
Absolutely. I think you kind of covered it all. We have a nice graphic here, which can also be found on the Silent Spring Silent Spring Institute's webpage, which is silentspring.org. And I urge everyone, we're going to share a couple graphics tonight while Laurel's speaking, but I would urge you to check out their website. We'll bring it up again here in a minute. So Laurel, my next question really is, what's the minimum? I mean, there's no way to eliminate it all currently. What's the minimum safety level that the state or the federal government has set on what is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Not that any of it's acceptable.
It's not good for you. Yeah. So it depends. At this point, it depends who you ask. So even though PFAS have been found in water supplies all across the country, and we know that PFAS exposures have been associated with a range of health effects, there is currently no federal drinking water standard for any PFAS chemicals. The EPA has provided guidelines, so suggested upper limits for how much there should be in drinking water for 2 specific PFAS chemicals. And to develop what those guidelines should be, they evaluated research studies in people and in laboratory animals and came up with some thresholds and some recommendations. Basically, people should aim to stay below this amount of exposure. A lot of scientists and some state regulators have looked at that recommendation and said that they don't think that the EPA guidelines are protective enough, and they actually think those numbers should be lower. So a variety of states, including here in Massachusetts, state agencies have come up with their own assessment of the scientific literature and developed their own guidelines for levels that they think are acceptable in drinking water.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about what Silent Spring Institute, where you are, what they are, what they're doing, and what their main focus is.
Great. So Silent Spring Institute is a nonprofit, independent scientific research organization. We were founded in 1994 by activists at the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. These visionary women were really alarmed to see that breast cancer rates on the Cape and the Islands were higher than other parts of Massachusetts. And they recognized that there wasn't a lot of research going on environmental causes of breast cancer. Obviously, treatment and diagnosis is very important. But they thought that there needed to be more research also on environmental causes, because they recognize that if we can find environmental causes of breast cancer, we can reduce those risk factors and prevent the disease in the first place, which is obviously much better than having to treat it later on. And so we were founded as a partner organization, a sister organization to Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, to conduct scientific research. So a lot of the work we do is like academic researchers. We design studies, we collect samples, and get a better understanding of chemical exposures. But we also have a commitment to sharing what we know. Sometimes academic researchers, tend to talk just to other scientists and may be cautious about, talking to the public or sharing what they know. But it's really a central focus for us is to share what we know, to work with our advocacy partners, to inform policymakers, to inform retailers, to make better decisions, and to inform the general public. People shouldn't have to worry about this when they go to the store. But in the short term, we do all have to educate ourselves about how to protect our health. And in the longer run, support policies that will keep people safe.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. So our research, a lot of our research focuses on trying to figure out which chemicals might play a role in breast cancer and other disease, looking at the scientific research studies in people and in animals, learning about the pathways in our bodies that can be affected by chemical exposures. And then a lot of our other research focuses on how we get exposed to these chemicals. So I'm kind of our water person. My background is in environmental chemistry and engineering. So I've been leading our water research studies. Some of my other colleagues focus on consumer products, indoor air, indoor dust, and understanding all the other ways that we can be exposed as well. And then our research goes in a lot of different directions as well. Some of our research focuses on how we report back information to take part in research studies. So if you sign up for a study, and hopefully some of your listeners will consider signing up for the study we'll talk about later, if people want to know, well, what did you find? What does this mean? And it's not enough to say, well, we're still learning and we're not going to tell you because we don't know. We, as scientists, have an obligation to say what we do know and to explain to the people who've given their time, their house dust, their blood or urine to our study, to tell them what their results mean.
So let's talk about the Cape specifically, because that was a nice transition in there. And so, as everybody may know out there or may not know, the Cape Cod is a sole aquifer. So we're a sole source aquifer, and 100% of our drinking water comes from this aquifer, okay? And it is designated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And while it's one of the most productive systems in New England, it also means, unfortunately, that the system and the water supply is susceptible to contamination from development and land uses within the watershed areas. And I know that, there's a couple towns in particular, and some more so than others, that have been affected by water sanitation issues. And I know towns are actively doing something about it. And so before we kind of delve in more to your specific to the study, Cape Cod's obviously had issues with contamination of the water supplies, in particular PFAS. Is there regular testing of the water supplies on the Cape?
So there are some contaminants in water that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. These are things that we've known about for a long time, like nitrate and lead and certain pesticides and other toxic metals. And chemicals that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act have to be monitored routinely by public water supplies. So if you're on a town water supply, and there are 17 different public water supplies on Cape Cod, your water supply has to test for those kinds of contaminants over time. And if there's an exceedance of a standard, they have to take action to meet those standards. PFAS are kind of in a funny spot because right now there's no federal drinking water standard. So aside from kind of a one-time testing program in 2013 to 2015, the EPA does not currently require public water supplies to do any testing for PFAS. But what's happened now is there's kind of a patchwork approach. So some states have said, well, the EPA isn't requiring us to do any testing, so we won't. And other states are doing a lot more to require testing. Just this past October, the state of Massachusetts adopted a new drinking water standard for PFAS chemicals. And so this means that even though across the country, not every water supply has to do testing, here in Massachusetts, water supplies will need to, if they haven't been already, they're going to need to start doing testing for PFAS. The state has been working with water systems. We have ideas about where PFAS might be coming from and which water supplies might be vulnerable. So there's water systems over time have been discovering PFAS contamination. So just over the past 5 or 10 years, water supplies have been starting to do some testing, and moving forward, there's going to be a lot more testing now that this standard is in place.
So, and before we get into specifics on Cape, what types of areas, I don't even say that word right, sorry everybody, what types of areas are more at risk for PFAS?
So there are some types of sources that are pretty commonly associated with PFAS. And one type of source that's a problem all across the country are a class of firefighting foams called AFFF. These are Class B firefighting foams, and they're used to put out fuel fires. So say if a plane catches on fire or an oil truck rolls over and there's a fire or a threat of a fire with liquid fuel, you can't use water or kind of conventional foam to fight those fires. But the Class B foam does a much better job of kind of smothering those fires. Again, because the PFAS are so persistent, they're even persistent at high temperatures. So they do a good job at putting out those fires. And they've been used for a lot of training over the years, so firefighters can be ready for those kinds of fires. However, chemicals can end up in groundwater near those areas. So where are these foams used? They're used at military bases, they're used at large airports, and they're used for other kinds of fire training activities. So this might sound familiar, especially if you live in Hyannis. There's the County Fire Training Academy in Hyannis, where fire departments over the years trained their firefighters to be prepared to, protect public safety. But as you mentioned, the Cape Cod aquifer is pretty permeable. So the groundwater moves pretty quickly. In other places, drinking water wells are located much deeper. Sometimes there are rock layers that are kind of a barrier, but the Cape has basically sand and gravelly soils. So water from the surface can trickle down. It's still slow compared to like the pace of our daily lives, but from this water cycle perspective, it's fairly rapid movement of water from the ground surface down to a level that might be pulled up in someone's private well or in a public well. So areas near those fire training areas are definitely at risk. In other parts of the country, not so much on the Cape, where these chemicals are manufactured, so near DuPont plants or near industries where they're like making Teflon coated glass or plastic. So for instance, in Merrimack, New Hampshire, there's a Saint-Gobain plant, just like in Hoosick Falls, which are two areas that have had PFAS show up in their drinking water. And then lower levels of PFAS can also show up in groundwater related to landfills or anything associated with waste, basically. So wastewater treatment plants and septic systems even can be sources of PFAS because, again, these are chemicals that are found in our everyday lives, and traces of those can end up in the groundwater. And then any businesses that rely on PFAS-containing products as well.
And you mentioned the county fire training facility, and I know at one point, like you said, they were training. Have they stopped training with that particular type of foam that can? Okay, can you tell us
at some point say again?
Tell us a little bit about that.
So actually, Silent Springs was the first to find PFAS in Cape Cod groundwater. This was back in 2010. We conducted a larger study of not just PFAS, but pharmaceuticals and flame retardants and other contaminants that aren't currently regulated in drinking water. PFAS have gained a lot of attention in recent years. Back in 2010, there were no Hollywood movies focused on PFAS or, sort of a daily stream of news articles related to PFAS. So we tested for just a couple of PFAS chemicals, and the highest levels that we found in that study were in Hyannis, and that kind of alerted people there got them thinking about the firefighting foams at the Fire Training Academy. And our understanding is that their policy changed at that point, and fire departments were no longer supposed to be using AFFF foam there.
Well, I'm glad that they were able to find an alternative because, again, sole source aquifer, I mean, it's the only one we have for the residents of this little peninsula that we live on. So it's imperative that we try and keep that aquifer clean and free of as many contaminants as possible. So I'm glad once they were alerted that they changed hands on that. What can be done about this from a personal perspective? What is something that people can do to advocate or to ensure safety of this for the community? What can parents do? Should they call legislators? I mean, we're going to talk a minute about the study that you're doing because they can participate in the study. But what else can people do to help?
So I kind of think about the PFAS challenge in a couple of ways. So one part is, what can we do to prevent new PFAS from getting out into the environment? And we've talked about this a little bit, calling your retailers and letting them know you want products that don't contain PFAS. And we've seen some major retailers, McDonald's is just the latest one, but Whole Foods and Chipotle have made commitments to changing what they use for their food packaging as well. So that kind of action from consumers can be really helpful. There are also legislative actions. So for instance, right now there's a bill that's being considered that would ban PFAS in food packaging. This is something that our partners at Mass Breast Cancer Coalition as well have been letting people know about, and they're supporting these bills that would ban PFAS in food packaging as a class. I think one of the challenges is not to just say, okay, well, we'll stop using these specific PFAS chemicals. And there actually are PFAS that are no longer manufactured in the US. They're the known bad actors. They stay in our bodies the longest. They have the strongest links to health effects. But instead of phasing out the whole group, manufacturers have just swapped them out for other PFAS chemicals. So it's really important where we can to treat these as a class and just say, these are very persistent chemicals. They move around in the environment. We just don't want to use any of them where they're not necessary. We can make decisions at kind of a more local level. So you could, depending on, what kind of a job you have, if you're for your company or for your school district, you have purchasing power. You could decide, like, the food packaging that we purchase for our town, we don't want any of that to contain PFAS. So cities and states have taken action as well, not just at an individual level. For the contamination that's already out in the environment, what we can hope to do is to minimize people's exposure. So I think it's a huge step forward that Massachusetts established the standard back in October. I think it's not the final step, because it's still just thinking about a few PFAS chemicals, and it's important to make sure that those standards adapt over time if we have new scientific information suggesting they should be lower, and there is evidence that maybe the levels need to be lower. And as we learn about more different PFAS chemicals, to make sure that that the regulations keep up with that, and also to make sure that water systems have funding that they need. It's quite expensive to design and implement the treatment that's necessary to keep people safe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Those are some great tips. So now let's talk about the study, because this is an issue that has obviously hit home. We kind of alluded to it with the town of Barnstable, in particular, that community of Hyannis. Let's talk a little bit more about the research there, and then the study and who qualifies, how to go about it, what that actually looks like. So take us through it, Laurel.
Okay. So we have a few different studies going on the Cape, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk about all of them, but I'll start by talking about our PFAS-REACH study. So REACH stands for Research, Education, and Action for Community Health. And it's actually a really unique study. It's a partnership between researchers from Silent Spring Institute, from Northeastern University and Michigan State University, and we're collaborating with community partners. So we're working with Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. We're working with the Testing for Peas group up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Community Action Works, which is a kind of a regional and national nonprofit advocacy group as well. And our PFAS-REACH study has a few different components to it. One is the PFAS Exchange website. I think you put up an infographic from that earlier. We've got fact sheets and a whole host of resources so that people can learn more about PFAS. For people who have PFAS water contamination, they can learn more about community groups in their area who are working on addressing PFAS water contamination issues. And we even have a tool where if you have your blood tested for PFAS or you find out about PFAS in your water, you can type in your results and you can receive information to help you interpret what those mean. Another major part of our PFAS-REACH study is a children's health study. So previous studies have found that children with higher PFAS exposures their immune systems may be affected. And so when they are vaccinated for things like diphtheria and tetanus, they don't mount as much of an antibody response as they normally would. Diphtheria and tetanus are not super common diseases right now. That's because of vaccinations. And, with everyone thinking about COVID and COVID vaccinations, people are thinking about this a lot more now and more concerned that people with higher PFAS exposures might be more vulnerable.
Let's take a minute on that, because that's really concerning. Tetanus, diphtheria, polio maybe. If it's affecting how your body is responding to that immunization, it's really then challenging us to really keep everybody safe from these diseases that should be eradicated. Not very many people get diphtheria or tetanus. We either get a vaccination or we get a shot after the fact if you get exposed. Polio is almost eradicated across the planet. I think 2 countries or 1 country left. And those are just to name a couple. But if PFAS are affecting our immune system, especially our children, that's really, really concerning. Because we need them to have the best possible chance, especially in this ever-changing world right now. We've now got COVID-19. And I'm sure this won't be the last virus that makes it around the world, this will not be the last pandemic. You know, I know there's some scientists out there who are saying we're going to see this more and more as the decades go on, as we approach 2100 with the population booming. So that's really, really concerning. I mean, we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot ahead of time with our children, and then we can't protect them after the fact because we've disabled their bodies to mount the correct response. So I think that's a really important point, is that this is something we can act on and we can advocate for and we can fight for. Give our kids and our grandkids a great chance for success.
Absolutely.
So children's study. Do you want me to show that graphic right now about the children?
Sure.
Okay.
So our study is currently looking to enroll parents in the Hyannis area. We're looking for preschool age children who live in Hyannis. And in particular, actually, we're looking for preschool age children whose mothers lived or worked in Hyannis prior to 2016. So you might say, like, why so far back in time? So 2016 is when the EPA lowered its guideline level for PFAS. Before that time, Hyannis had higher levels of PFAS in their drinking water because of the fire training activities and the vulnerability of those wells because they were so close to the fire training academy. So back before 2016, the levels of PFAS in the drinking water were much higher. Now the Hyannis water system, and I really want to make sure people understand that the Hyannis water system has done a fabulous job. They've invested millions of dollars to put in new treatment. And the water system is now meeting the new Massachusetts standard, which again is one of the strictest in the country. So I don't want people to get the impression that the Hyannis water system is high PFAS now. Right. However, because these chemicals can act on our bodies over a long period of time, they can accumulate in our bodies, we are concerned about the potential for sort of longer term effects, and that women who lived in Hyannis before all that treatment went into effect, that there might be a longer term effect in terms of their children's immune systems. So we can't change those past exposures, but we can learn about how these chemicals might affect people's health. So our study is currently recruiting families with preschool age children whose mothers lived or worked in Hyannis prior to 2016. And for people who are interested in taking part in our study, up on the screen there's a web address and an email address and a phone number to call or text. What it would involve to take part in our study would be to have your child come in for a blood draw. And my kids are older now, but when my kids were 4, the idea of bringing them in for a blood draw is certainly no easy task. So I know that might seem daunting, but for the sake of science and to really learn about these chemicals, and like you said, with COVID now more than ever, it's so important for us to do what we can to make sure we're protecting children's immune systems, and to learn what we can and to see if the drinking water standards that we have in place are good enough to make sure that kids' immune systems will be protected. So we'll ask parents to bring their child into the Cape Cod Healthcare lab on Yellow Brick Road. It's right near the hospital. It's currently on hold, the blood collection with COVID. We're holding off on that actual piece of it, but parents who are interested can still contact our team. We can tell you a little bit more about the study, walk you through the consent process. And if you're eligible, we'll be ready to go and to collect those blood samples once things get better with COVID and once it's safe for people to be kind of more out and about.
So this is a good time to get pre-screened for it, ask your questions, get information, see if you're up to it.
We're all stuck at home anyway, so you might as well call and learn more about it. And the great thing is that there are some benefits for people who take part in our study. So knowledge is power. So of course,
number one.
Number one is contributing to our broader understanding of these common everyday chemicals that aren't just in our water, but are in consumer products and in food as well. You'll also get a report with the results from your child's testing. And we'll be measuring for a few different things. So one is to measure PFAS levels. And this gives us a sense of a child's exposure. Children who have higher PFAS in their blood, that's an indication that they've had higher PFAS exposures. And we'll also measure antibody levels. We started the study thinking about diphtheria and tetanus. Those are two types of antibodies that have been shown to be affected by PFAS in previous studies. And we're also looking for whether we could also include COVID antibody testing to address the new and emerging concern that we didn't know about when we started to plan this study a few years ago.
That would be really interesting if you're able to include that.
Absolutely. And we'll be doing some other newer types of testing. It's called metabolomics. It's a new way to understand a little bit more about all the biological pathways in our bodies, not just this one outcome, like are your antibody levels low or not, but at a more molecular level, how PFAS might be affecting our bodies. And so parents will receive a report with the results of the antibody testing and the PFAS testing. And we have experts on our team who've been thinking about this for decades, how to provide this information in a way, even though we don't know, unlike lead, where there's kind of a bright red line. We've all brought our kids in for lead testing, and there's a certain cutoff where if you're above that, then that triggers, a home visit or some extra concern for how to figure out why lead levels are high. There's no bright red line for PFAS. We're still learning at what level they might be harmful, but we can compare children, so you can see sort of where you fall in the distribution, and we do as much as we can to help you understand what those results mean. And then the third benefit is that your child's also eligible, or you are eligible. You can receive a $100 gift card if you both provide the blood sample by bringing your child in, and also fill out a questionnaire. So we want to know more about your child's early life exposures. We'll have some questions about where you've lived over time, ask questions about your water consumption. Did you consume bottled water, tap water, filtered water, to get some sense of what children's exposures might have been earlier in time.
Oh my gosh, this sounds like a great study, and I think there's a lot of benefits to this. Not only the benefits you're talking, but again, knowledge, the fact that you're acting and doing something that will actively contribute to solving this issue. And while we don't know everything, as you say, we do know that there is harm caused by it. It can lower the immune system. That's what we're really seeing in some of this. And again, as the world is rapidly changing and we're being exposed to new viruses, again, we need to give our kids the best possible chance for success, and the generation after that. That's our responsibility as parents. So to act on this now, I urge anyone, who lived and worked in Hyannis, so they should have a preschool age child. What do you define preschool? Is that like anywhere from, 2016, so 4 to 6?
Right. So, yeah. So the in many cases, children themselves may not have been exposed to the water when the PFAS levels were higher. The timing's a little bit related to actually their vaccination history. So again, we've all been thinking about antibodies, and you get your vaccine, and the goal is to boost up your body's antibody levels, which are our body's way of fending off a disease if we get exposed again in the future. And over time, those antibody levels can go down. That's why we get booster shots. So we decided to kind of aim for a narrow age range of kids so that we could keep that kind of consistent in terms of the timing of kids' vaccinations. So the reason for focusing on preschool age children is that kids at either age 4 or 5 get their final DTaP booster shot. So this is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. And we'd like for children to come in within a year of getting that final booster shot. So a lot of kids get that at age 4. So we're looking at that year after kids get that booster shot. And I looked at my kids' vaccination record. One of them had it when they were 4, and one of them had it when they were 5. So the timing's a little bit specific to each child's vaccination history as well. But we would like for children to come in within that year after getting their final DTaP booster shot.
And if you're not sure, you can reach out via this email, the phone number, which you can call or text, or the website down there, the PFAS exchange.org/children's study. And I'm going to put that up here again in a second before we close out.
But, and I don't want anyone to feel excluded if you say like, oh, my child's a little bit older, maybe they don't quite fit it within this range. But if you're really concerned about PFAS levels within your child, we would like to find a way in a second phase of the study to offer PFAS testing for parents whose kids might not be eligible. And we also have another study that maybe I can come back another time and tell you more about that's just getting underway. That's going to be a much larger study and will include children ages 4 to 17 and adults. It's going to be conducted also in Hyannis and in the town of Air in the Metro West Boston area. Their water system, just like in Hyannis, had PFAS contamination as well, in their case from Fort Devens military base. So this is a larger study. It's looking at immune system effects, but also effects on thyroid hormones and on cholesterol and a range of other effects too. So that's just in the early planning stages for that study. We'll likely start recruiting in April or May and getting the word out. So even if your child's too old for this, if you call us, we'll put you on the list and we'll let you know about that other study.
I like that. So if you have questions about that one or you're not quite sure where you fit, reach out to them. They're happy to answer the questions.
We're stuck at home too, so
I kind of fit you where you belong. I mean, it's as good of a time as any. So any closing thoughts, Laurel, about all this?
Well, first off, I really want to thank you for having me. I love that you are doing this, and happy to have this opportunity to talk with you and to talk with parents on the Cape. I think for parents who might be eligible for a study, like, we would love to hear from you and help talk through what we're looking for our study. If you live in an area where your water's not contaminated, these are still PFAS, are still of concern, and it's important for everyone to educate themselves. You can look at the PFAS Exchange website. We have tip sheets with information about how you can reduce your exposures. But I guess I would close by saying, like, PFAS is just one type of chemical. There are other chemicals in our everyday lives of concern. PFAS just happens to be the ones that are raising the most concern, and they're kind of the most visible right now. But there are other types of chemicals as well that we really should try to avoid in our daily lives. So I've also put in a plug for our Detox Me app. I think I sent you a picture of that as well. You can learn more about that on the Silent Spring website. It's a smartphone app for iPhones and Android devices. It gives you tips and do-it-yourself recipes, all based on our science and other research science, on ways that we can reduce exposures to things that shouldn't be a part of our daily lives and help keep our families safe.
That Detox Me app she's talking about is down in our lower left-hand corner right now, and that can also be accessed via the PFAS-exchange.org website, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you came on tonight, Laurel. It's always a pleasure. I have enjoyed getting to know about the research over the past couple of years, having you guys at the resource fair. I'm sad too that it couldn't happen, but in a way, I'm blessed that it has given way to being able to virtually connect with people and connect them back to these resources every week, like we're doing here on the Parent Pod. And we'd be happy to have you back again as things kind of amp up, and talking to our parents as the other study gets going and this one, because we'll be really interested to hear. So everybody, the website down here, PFAS-exchange.org/children's study. That's the primary one. They're looking for you to reach out, give a call. She's home. She wants to hear from you. She wants to find out how, we can get some studies done for our kids. And that's ultimately what it's all about. So I want to thank you so much for coming on about all this. I think
Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.
Yeah, it's an important topic. There's so much we have to worry about these days, but education, knowledge is always power, because then we can move forward and we can take the steps we need to take with that knowledge. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Next week, we have yet to determine our guests. It's still up in the air. We're just waiting to solidify. But just to highlight some upcoming guests in the coming months coming on, we're going to have head chef Brandon Babiaz from Marshland Restaurant to make us family-friendly and kid-friendly recipes that we're going to make together. We've got Erin Edwards coming up from Upper Cape Med Aesthetics to do another beauty self-care episode. We're going to have Jacob Stapleton from Children's Cove, a ton of other guests. And later in April, I'm teasing this now for Below Deck fans or my Bravo crew that are watching out there. We're going to be having Chef Rachel Hargrove from Below Deck to make Vietnamese spring rolls with us one day. So we've got a lot coming up, and we're also going to be highlighting some local mom businesses and dad businesses and some other educational topics. So stay tuned. I want to share one more link with everybody. For those who may not know, you need to make sure, because nobody gave us a comment tonight, Laurel. I don't know what's going on. Last week we had comments, it just happens like that. But we've had nobody nominate any of our kindness nominations for a couple weeks now, which is really disappointing because I like to give away free things to people. And nobody wants to nominate their best friend. Nobody's out there deserving of a random act of kindness, I guess. But if you visit this website down below, Linktree, with the dot between the R and the E's / Cape Cod Moms, there are forms you can fill out. You can submit questions in advance for our guests, and you can also nominate your best friend or a mom friend or a dad friend to receive a little act of kindness, brighten their day. Maybe it's someone who's deserving, who's done you a favor, or someone just needs a pick-me-up in the middle of the pandemic. We like to give a little act of kindness. You can share funny stories. We'll keep them anonymous and share them sometime during our studio episodes. So thank you again, Laurel, for joining us. We will definitely have you on again, maybe with Cheryl too.
Oh, yeah. That would be fabulous.
I think that would be a fun episode. And again, everybody out there, check out their website and email, text, call. I'm going to throw it up there one more time. And I'm actually going to close out to it as Laurel and I say goodbye. Don't hang up, Laurel. We'll be here in the background until it stops. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us. We'll see you next week. Remember, new night, Friday nights, 8 p.m. That hour is for you. And if not, catch it on the replay on the website or on all our social media channels. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week, 8 p.m. Bye.
Thank you.